Hello, I'm Stefan Clarkson. This is video exam 1. To start, I chose the first and second prompts. So to start on the first prompt, explain and critically analyze Kant's theory of ethics. So to start, Kant's theory of ethics are moral principles that stem from rationality rather than consequences of action. So according to Kant, moral agents possess inherent worth and are capable of acting toward an end by using their free will. So in his view, ethical behavior involves adhering to universal and objective moral laws that every rational agent should follow. So in this video, we will discuss Kant's major points in his theory of ethics, including his agency, the two formulations of the categorical imperative, and contradictions of conception and will, and how to determine what actions are right. It will also examine objections and loopholes in Kant's ethical theory that arise. So to start, my first point regarding agency. Kant believed that rational beings possess intrinsic worth or dignity, and their actions should reflect their worth. He argued that entities that do not possess rationality, such as animals or objects, don't have dignity and cannot be treated the same. So hence, moral agents have a duty to respect and treat others with dignity. Moving on, Kant articulated two formulations of the categorical imperative to gauge morality of an action. So the first formulation states that an action is moral if it can be universalized. So in other words, if an individual can will everyone to act the same way without a contradiction, they are obeying the moral law. So, for example, if I want to steal a book, but if everyone wants to steal a book also, it would undermine the concept of property rights. So the moral law would be contradicted. So in other words, stealing is immoral according to Kant's theory. The second formulation of the categorical imperative says that we should treat other people as ends in themselves and not just as means in our ends. So what this means is individuals should be treated with respect and not merely as instruments to fulfill our desires. So according to Kant, people have intrinsic worth, and actions that subordinate others to our needs devalue their worth. So for instance, lying to someone in an interview, like a job interview, lying to someone to obtain a job may fulfill your end, but it reduces the dignity of the person being lied to, thereby not adhering to Kant's ethical principle. So Kant argued that a contradiction of conception occurs when the maximum of an action renders it impossible to be universalized. So what this means is, an example of this, if someone lies to gain some advantage over another person, it is contradictory to universalize it, since lying undermines the truth. So, which is necessary for rational agents to communicate. So, lying cannot be a universal law according to Kant's theory. So, a contradiction of the will may rise when the maximum of an action cannot be accomplished due to external factors or desires. So what this means, for example, if someone plans to steal something, but they end up getting caught before they can do so, their will is contradicted. So Kant maintains that intentions matter in analyzing an action's morality and not just an outcome. So in determining what actions are right, Kant argued that actions must meet specific tests. So, according to Kant, moral actions must be motivated by respect of moral law. It cannot be influenced by external factors. So this is like awards or punishment. So moving on, like actions should adhere to categorical imperative and enable individuals to express their inherent dignity. And like lastly on this point, rational agents should assume responsibility for their actions and adhere to universal moral laws. So moving on to the arguments against Kant. So like despite the strengths of Kant's theory, there are several criticisms of it. So one criticism argues that Kant's approach is too rigid and inflexible. So since like moral laws apply universally, there is no consideration for individual circumstances or context. So we can go back to the man at the door, talking about over that lesson where there is a murder at a door, you're at the door, and your friend's in the house. You can lie to your friend. You can lie to the murderer that your friend isn't home. Because if you tell him he's home, you know that the murderer is going to go in and murder your friend. Kant's theory does not take this into consideration. So it would, lying in this circumstance in Kant's theory would be immoral. It would be wrong. And personally, I think that is one of the main criticisms of it, is it doesn't take anything into context, because we all believe, most of us should believe, that lying to the murderer would be morally right, because you were considering life and death, and you were talking to someone who doesn't have the ethical morals that most people in society obtain. So another criticism questions Kant's claim that agency is purely rational. So it assumes that factors like emotions and intuition don't play a role in moral decision making. Which is an oversimplification of human nature, because most ethical decisions for us are based off intuition, and you have to take in consideration of the emotional standards of humans. So, lastly, Kant's theory doesn't address cultural differences in ethical behavior. So different cultures have different values and moral codes. So in Kant's theory, this doesn't account for their perspectives. And this is another big loophole in it, because every culture, every religion has different standards of ethics, different learning, and different experiences that they build upon their moral and ethical codes of life. So Kant's theory does not take into consideration of this, because it's universal. So to conclude this part of the question and move on to my next one, Kant's ethical theory emphasizes the importance of rationality, moral principles, and the agency in making moral decisions. So it highlights moral laws, and they should be applied universally and should be independent of subjective premises or context. While Kant's theory proposes a compelling framework for evaluating ethical dilemmas, it is a rigid approach, and it lacks nuance, it lacks account for cultural differences around society. So moving on to my next prompt and question would be: explain and critically analyze the theory of utilitarianism. So this is an ethical theory that aims to promote the greatest good for the greatest number of people. So according to this theory, an action is morally right if it maximizes happiness or pleasure and minimizes pain or suffering. So like the main proponent of this theory is moral decisions should be made based on a calculation of potential consequences of each decision. So the main point of this theory is to promote happiness and prevent suffering. So in this sense, it means that it is focuses on the end result of an action rather than the action itself. So this theory seeks to achieve an objective standard of morality, which is deduced from the empirical observation of human experience. So this theory aims or claims that actions ultimately lead to happiness, pleasure, or reduction. So one of the strengths of this theory is that it is relatively easy to understand and apply. So, for example, when faced with an ethical dilemma, the only thing you have to consider is the potential outcome of each possible decision you choose, and the outcome needs to maximize overall happiness. So, for example, if I choose to buy something for my friends, but the money, it's a lot of money, but 5 of my friends would maximize their happiness, I would not be happy about it, buying a very expensive item. It would be morally right for me to buy that item because it maximizes their happiness and it maximizes happiness overall. There's one person unhappy compared to 5. So this theory is flexible and it can take into account the variety of moral values and traditions that exist in different cultures. Sorry about that. Another criticism of this theory is that it can be difficult to determine what brings about the greatest good. So utilitarianism relies on subjective judgments of what constitutes happiness or pleasure. And it is not always clear how to weigh different types of happiness or suffering against one another. So the first objective, some utilitarians argue that individual rights and liberties should not be considered when determining the consequences of an action. So, like, in other words, utilitarianism should not be used as a justification for rights violation. So, for example, for a principle, so if John advocated for a principle of harm, which asserts that individuals should be free to act as long as it does not harm others. So to address the second objection, some utilitarians argue that there are certain objective criteria that can be used to determine what constitutes happiness or pleasure. So one example of this criteria is which attempts to measure the quantity and quality of pleasure and pain in order to determine the moral worth of an action. And this was calculated and developed by Bentham, the philosopher. So in conclusion, while utilitarianism is a valuable ethical theory, it is not without its problems. While its emphasis on the greatest good for the greatest number has appeal, it has failure to account for individual rights and independence on subjective judgments of happiness and pleasure. And this is proven to be problematic with this theory. So by taking into account the objections outlined above of what I talked, utilitarianism may be refined and adapted to better address contemporary ethical issues. So this concludes my video exam 1. Thank you. Have a good one.